All right, I've got that last one uploading right now. I figured I might as well finish this chapter. I've gotten about halfway. And there's 4 chapters in this book, but they're all hugely huge. Looks like chapter 3 is the longest. No, chapter 4 is the longest one. Anyway, I'm going to give it a shot, try to finish chapter 1. The patrician of Ankh-Morpork smiled, but with his mouth only. "The hum gate, you say," he murmured. The guard captain saluted smartly. "High lord, we had to shoot the horse before he would stop." "Which by a fairly direct route brings you here," said the patrician, looking down at Rincewind. "And what have you got to say for yourself?" It was rumored that an entire wing of the patrician's palace was filled with clerks who spent their days collating and updating all the information collected by their master's exquisitely organized spy system. Rincewind didn't doubt it. He glanced toward the balcony that ran down one side of the audience room. A sudden run, a nimble jump, a sudden hail of crossbow quarrels. He shuddered. The patrician cradled his chins in a beringed hand, and regarded the wizard with eyes as small and hard as beads. "Let me see," he said. "Oath-breaking, the theft of a horse, uttering false coinage. Yes, I think it's the arena for you, Rincewind." This was too much. "I didn't steal the horse, I bought it fairly." "But with false coinage, technically theft, you see." "But those Rhinu are solid gold." "Rhinu?" The patrician rolled one of them around in his thick fingers. "Is that what they're called? How interesting. But as you point out, they're not very similar to dollars." "Well, of course they're not." "Ah, then you admit it." Rincewind opened his mouth to speak, thought better of it, and shut it again. "Quite so, and on top of these there is, of course, the immoral obloquy attendant on the cowardly betrayal of a visitor to this shore. For shame, Rincewind." The patrician waved a hand vaguely. The guards behind Rincewind backed away, and their captain took a few paces to the right. Rincewind suddenly felt very alone. It is said that when a wizard is about to die, Death himself turns up to claim him, instead of delegating the task to a subordinate such as disease or famine, as is usually the case. Rincewind looked around nervously for a tall figure in black. Wizards, even failed wizards, have in addition to rods and cones in their eyeballs, the tiny octagons that enable them to see into the far octarine, the basic color of which all other colors are merely pale shadows impinging on normal four-dimensional space. It is said to be a sort of fluorescent greenish-yellow-purple. Was that a flickering shadow in the corner? "Of course," said the patrician. "I could be merciful." The shadow disappeared. Rincewind looked up, an expression of insane hope on his face. "Yes," he said. The patrician waved a hand again. Rincewind saw the guards leave the chamber. Alone with the overlord of the Twin Cities, he almost wished they would come back. "Come hither, Rincewind," said the patrician. He indicated a bowl of savories on a low onyx table by the throne. "Would you care for a crystallized jellyfish? No?" Said Rincewind. "No." "Now I want you to listen very carefully to what I am about to say," said the patrician amiably. "Otherwise you will die. In an interesting fashion. Over a period. Please, stop fidgeting like that. Since you are a wizard of sorts, of course you are aware that we lived on a world shaped as it were like a disk, and that there is said to exist toward the far rim a continent which is, though small enough, is equal in weight to all the mighty land masses in this hemicircle, and that this, according to ancient legend, is because it is largely made of gold?" Rincewind nodded. Who hadn't heard of the counterweight continent? Some sailors even believed that the childhood tales, and sailed to search for it. Of course, they returned either empty-handed or not at all, probably eaten by giant turtles, in the opinion of the more serious mariners. Because, of course, the counterweight continent was nothing more than a solar myth. It does, of course, exist, said the patrician. Although it is not made of gold, it is true that gold is very common metal there. Most of the mass is made up by vast deposits of octarine deep within the crust. Now it will be obvious to an incisive mind like yours that the existence of the counterweight continent poses a deadly threat to our people here. He paused, looking at Rincewind's open mouth. He sighed, and then said, "Do you by some chance fail to follow me?" Said Rincewind. He swallowed and licked his lips. No. Gold. I see, said the patrician sweetly. You feel, perhaps, that it would be a marvelous thing to go to the counterweight continent and bring back a shipload of gold. Rincewind had a feeling that some sort of trap was being set. Yes, he ventured. And if every man on the shores of the Circle Sea had a mountain of gold of his own, would that be a good thing? What would happen? Think carefully. Rincewind's brow furrowed. He thought, we'd all be rich. The way the temperature fell at his remark told him that it was not the correct one. I may as well tell you, Rincewind, that there is some contact between the lords of the Circle Sea and the Emperor of the Agadian Empire, as it is styled, said the patrician went on. It is only very slight. There is little common ground between us. We have nothing they want, and they have nothing we can afford. It is an old empire, Rincewind, old and cunning and cruel and very, very rich. So we exchange fraternal greetings by albatross mail at infrequent intervals. One such letter arrived this morning. A subject of the emperor appears to have taken onto his head to visit our city. It appears he wishes to look at it. Only a madman who would possibly undergo all the privations of crossing the turnwise ocean in order to merely look at anything. However, he landed this morning. He might have met a great hero, or the cunningest of thieves, or some wise and great sage. He met you. He has employed you as a guide. You will be a guide, Rincewind, to this looker, this two-flower. You will see that he returns home with a good report of our little homeland. What do you say to that?
Oh, thank you, Lord, said Rincewind miserably.
There is another point, of course. It would be a tragedy should anything untoward happen to our little visitor. It would be dreadful if he were to die, for example. Dreadful for the whole of our land, because the Agadian Emperor looks after his own and could certainly extinguish us at a nod, a mere nod. And that would be dreadful for you, Rincewind, because in the weeks that remained before the Empire's huge mercenary fleet arrived, certain of my servants would occupy themselves around your person in hope that the avenging captains on their arrival might find their anger tempered by the sight of your still living body. There are certain spells that can prevent the life from departing the body, be it ever so abused, and I see by your face that understanding dawns. I beg your pardon?
Yes, my lord, I'll see to it. I'll endeavor to see. I'll try to look after him and see that he comes to no harm.
And after that, I'll get a job juggling snowballs through hell, he added bitterly in the privacy of his own skull. Capital! I gather already that you and Two-Flower are on the best of terms. An excellent beginning. When he returns safely to his homeland, you will not find me ungrateful. I shall probably even dismiss the charges against you. Thank you, Rincewind. You may go. Rincewind decided not to ask for the return of his 5 remaining Rhinu. He backed away, cautiously. Oh, and there is one more thing, the patrician said, as the wizard groped for the door handles.
Yes, Lord,
he replied with a sinking heart. I'm sure you won't dream of trying to escape from your little obligations by fleeing the city. I judge you to be a born city person. But you may be sure that the lords of the other cities will be appraised of these conditions by nightfall.
I assure you the thought never even crossed my mind, Lord.
Indeed? Then if I were you, I would sue my face for slander. Rincewind reached the broken drum at a dead run, and was just in time to collide with a man who came out backward, fast. The stranger's haste was in part accounted for by the spear in his chest. He bubbled noisily and dropped dead at the wizard's feet. Rincewind peered around the doorframe and jerked back as a heavy throwing axe whirred past like a partridge. It was probably a lucky throw, a second cautious glance told him. The dark interior of the drum was a broil of fighting men, quite a number of them. A third and longer glance confirmed in bits. Rincewind swayed back as a wildly thrown stool sailed past and smashed on the far side of the street. Then he dove in. He was wearing a dark robe, made darker by constant wear and irregular washings. In the raging gloom, no one appeared to notice a shadowy shape that shuffled desperately from table to table. At one point, a fighter, staggering back, trod on what felt like fingers. A number of what felt like teeth bit his ankle. He yelped shrilly and dropped his guard, just sufficiently for a sword swung by a surprised opponent to skewer him. Rincewind reached for the stairway, sucking his bruised hand and running with a curious bent-over gait. A crossbow quarrel thunked into the banister rail above him, and he gave a whimper. He made the stairs in one breathless rush, expecting at any moment another, more accurate shot. In the corridor above, he stood upright, gasping, and saw the floor in front of him scattered with bodies. A big black bearded man with a bloody sword in one hand was trying a door handle. "Hey!" screamed Rincewind. The man looked around, and then, almost absent-mindedly, drew a short throwing knife, from his bandolier and hurled it. Rincewind ducked. There was a brief scream behind him as the crossbowman, sighting down his weapon, dropped it and clutched at his throat. The big man was already reaching for another knife. Rincewind looked around wildly, and then with wild improvisation drew himself up into a wizardly pose. His hand was flung back. "Asoniti! Kyorucha! Bezelblor!" The man hesitated, his eyes flicking nervously from side to side as he waited for the magic. The conclusion that there was not going to be any hit him at the same time as Rincewind, whirring wildly down the passage, and kicked him sharply in the groin. As he screamed and clutched at himself, the wizard dragged open the door, sprang inside, slammed it behind him, and threw his body against it, panting. It was quiet in here. There was Two-Flower, sleeping peacefully on the low bed, and there at the foot of the bed was the luggage. Rincewind took a few steps forward, cupidity moving him as easily as if he were on little wheels. The chest was open. There were bags inside, and in one of them he caught the gleam of gold. For a moment, greed overcame caution, and he reached out gingerly. But what was the use? He'd never lived to enjoy it. Reluctantly, he drew his hand back and was surprised to see a slight tremor in the chest's open lid. Hadn't it shifted slightly, as though rocked by the wind? Rincewind looked at his fingers and then at the lid. It looked heavy, and was bound with brass bands. It was quite still now. What wind? "Rincewind!" Two-Flower sprang off the bed. The wizard jumped back, wrenching his features into a smile. "My dear chap, right on time! We'll have the lunch, and then I'm sure you've got a wonderful program lined up for the afternoon." That's great!" Rincewind took a deep breath. "Look," he said desperately, "let's eat somewhere else. There's been a bit of a fight down below." "A tavern brawl? Why didn't you wake me up?" "Well, you see, What?" "I thought I made myself clear this morning, Rincewind. I want to see genuine Morporkian life, the slave market, the whore pits, the temple of small gods, the beggars' guild, and a genuine tavern brawl." A faint note of suspicion entered Two-Flower's voice. "You do have them, don't you? You know, people swinging on the chandelier, sword fights over the table, that sort of thing? The sort of thing Hrun, the barbarian, and the weasel are always getting involved in. You know, excitement." Rincewind sat down heavily on the bed. "You want to see a fight?" he said. "Yes, what's wrong with that?" "For a start, people get hurt." "Oh, I wasn't suggesting we get involved. I just want to see one, that's all. And some of your famous heroes. You do have some, don't you? It's not all dockside talk." And now to the wizard's astonishment, Two-Flower was almost pleading. "Oh yeah, we have them all right," said Rincewind hurriedly. He pictured them in his mind and recoiled from the thought. All the heroes of the Circle C passed through the gates of Ankh-Morpork sooner or later. Most of them were from the barbaric tribes near the frozen hub, which had a sort of export trade in heroes. Almost all of them had crude magic swords, whose unsuppressed harmonics on the astral plane played hell with any delicate experiments in applied sorcery for miles around. But Rincewind didn't object to them on that score. He knew himself to be a magical dropout, so it didn't bother him that the mere appearance of a hero at the city gates was enough to cause retorts to explode and demons to materialize all throughout the magical quarter. No, what he didn't like about heroes was that they were usually suicidally gloomy when sober and homicidally insane when drunk. There were too many of them, too. Some of them were notable. Some of the most notable questing grounds near the city were a veritable hubbub in the season. There was talk of organizing a rota. He rubbed his nose. The only heroes he had much time for were Bravd and the Weasel, who were out of town at the moment, and Hrun the Barbarian, who was practically an academic by hub standards, in that he could think without moving his lips. Hrun was said to be roving somewhere turnwise. "Look," he said at last, "have you ever met a barbarian?" Two-Flower shook his head. "I was afraid of that," said Rincewind. "Well, there was a clatter of running feet on the street outside and a fresh uproar from downstairs. It was followed by a commotion on the stairs. The door was flung open before Rincewind could collect himself sufficiently to make a dash for the window. But instead of the greed-crazed madman he expected, he found himself looking into the round, red face of a sergeant of the watch. He breathed again. Of course, the watch were always careful not to intervene too soon in any brawl where the odds were not heavily stacked in their favor. The job carried a pension, and attracted a cautious, thoughtful kind of man. The sergeant glowered at Rincewind and then peered at Two-Flower with interest. "Everything all right in here?" he said. "Oh, fine," said Rincewind. "Got held up, did you?" The sergeant ignored him. "This the foreigner, then?" he inquired. "We were just leaving," said Rincewind quickly, and then switched to Traub. "Two-Flower, I think we ought to get lunch somewhere. I know some places." He marched out into the corridor with as much aplomb as he could muster. Two-Flower followed, and a few seconds later there was a strangling sound from the sergeant as the luggage closed its lid with a snap, stood up, stretched, and marched after them. Watchmen were dragging bodies out of the room downstairs. There were no survivors. The watch had ensured this by giving them ample time to escape via the back door, a neat compromise between caution and justice that benefited all parties. "Who are these men?" said Two-Flower. "Oh, you know, just men," said Rincewind, and before he could stop himself, had some part of his brain that had nothing to do, took control of his mouth, and added, "Heroes, in fact." "Really?" When one foot is stuck into the gray miasma of Hrul, it is much easier to step right in and sink rather than prolong the struggle. Rincewind let himself go. "Yes, that one over there is Erig strong in the arm. Over there is Black Zeno." "Is Hrun the Barbarian here?" said Two-Flower, looking around eagerly. Rincewind took a deep breath. "That's him behind us," he said. The enormity of this lie was so great that its ripples did, in fact, spread out from one of the lower astral planes as far as the magical quarter across the river, where it picked up tremendous velocity from the huge standing wave of power that always hovered there and bounced wildly across the Circle Sea. A harmonic got as far as Hrun himself, currently fighting a couple of gnolls on the crumbling ledge high in the Cade-Rack Mountains, and caused him a moment's unexplained discomfort. Two-Flower, meanwhile, had thrown back the lid of the luggage and was hastily pulling out a black, heavy cube. "This is fantastic," he said. "They're never going to believe this at home." "What's he going on about?" said the sergeant doubtfully. "He's pleased you rescued us," said Rincewind. He looked sideways at the black box, half expecting it to explode or emit strange musical tones. "Ah," said the sergeant. He too was staring at the box. Two-Flower smiled brightly at them. "I'd like to record this event," he said. "Do you think you could ask them to all stand over by the window, please? This won't take but a moment. And, Rincewind." "Yes." Two-Flower stood on a tiptoe to whisper, "I expect you to know what this is, don't you?" Rincewind stared at the box. It had a round glass eye protruding from the center of one face and a lever at the back. "Not wholly," he said. "It is a device for making pictures quickly," said Two-Flower. "Quite a new invention. I'm rather proud of it, but look. I don't think these gentlemen would, they might be sort of apprehensive. Could you explain it to them? I'll reimburse them for their time, of course."
He's got a box with a demon in it that draws pictures, said Rincewind shortly. Do what the madman says and he will give you a lot of gold.
The watch smiled nervously. I'd like you in the picture, Rincewind. That's fine. Two Flower took out a golden disc that Rincewind had noticed before, squinted at its unseen face for a moment, muttered, 30 seconds should do it. Should just about do it. And then smiled and said brightly, Smile, please.
Smile,
rasped Rincewind. There was a whir from the box. Right! High above the disc, the second albatross soared, so high, in fact, that its tiny mad orange eyes could see the whole of the world in the great, glittering, girdling Circle C. There was a yellow message capsule strapped to one leg. Far below, unseen in the clouds, the bird that had brought the earlier message to the patrician of Ankh-Morpork flapped gently back to its home. Rincewind looked at the tiny square of glass in astonishment. There he was, all right, a tiny figure in perfect color standing in front of a group of watchmen whose faces were each frozen in a terrified rictus. A buzz of wordless terror went up from the men around him as they craned over his shoulder to look. Grinning, Two Flower produced a handful of the smaller coins Rincewind now recognized as a quarter Rhinu. He winked at the wizard. I had similar problems when I stopped over in the Brown Islands, he said. They thought the iconograph steals bits of their soul. Laughable, isn't it?
Yugg,
said Rincewind, and then, somewhat, because somehow that was hardly enough to keep up his side of the conversation, he added, I don't think it looks very like me, though. It's easy to operate, said Two Flower, ignoring him. Look, all you have to do is press this button. The iconograph does the rest. Now I'll just stand over here next to Haroon and you can take the picture. The coins quieted the men's agitation in the way that gold can, and Rincewind was amazed to find half a minute later that he was holding a little glass portrait of Two Flower wielding a huge notched sword, and smiling as though all his dreams had come true. They lunched at a small eating house near the Brass Bridge, with the luggage nestled under the table. The food and the wine, far superior to Rincewind's normal fare, did much to relax him. Things weren't going to be too bad, he decided. A bit of invention and some quick thinking, that was all that he needed. Two Flower seemed to be thinking too. Looking reflectively into his wine cup, he said, Tavern fights are pretty common around here, I'd expect.
Oh, fairly.
No doubt fixtures and fittings get damaged.
Oh, I see. You mean like benches and whatnot. Yeah, I suppose so.
That must be upsetting for the innkeepers.
I never really thought about it. I suppose it must be one of the risks of the job.
Two Flower regarded him thoughtfully. I might be able to help there, he said. Risks are my business. I say this food is a bit greasy, isn't it?
You did say you wanted to try the typical Morporkian food, said Rincewind. What about the risks?
Oh, I know all about risks. They're my business.
I thought that's what you said. I didn't believe it the first time either.
Oh, I don't take risks. About the most exciting thing that happened to me was knocking some ink over. I assess risks. Day after day. Do you know what the odds are against a house catching fire in the Red Triangle district of Bespelargic? 538 to 1. I calculated that. And he added this with a bit of pride.
What?
Rincewind tried to suppress a burp.
What for? Excuse me?
He helped himself to some more wine. For? Two Flower paused. I can't say it in Traub, he said. I think the Betrobi word have a word for it. In my language we call it, he said a collection of outlandish syllables. In sewer ants.
In sewer ants?
Repeated Rincewind.
That's funny. Word, what's it mean?
Well, I suppose you have a ship loaded with, say, gold bars. It might run into storms or be taken by pirates. You don't want that to happen, so you take out an in-sewer ants policy. I work out all the odds against the cargo being lost, based on weather reports and piracy records for the last 20 years, and then I add a bit, then you pay me some money based on those odds.
And the bit, Rincewind said, waggling a finger solemnly.
And then, if the cargo is lost, I reimburse you.
Reimburse?
Pay you the value of your cargo, said Two Flower patiently.
I get it. It's like a bet, right?
A wager? Yes, in a way, I suppose.
And you make money at this in sewer ants?
It offers a return on investment, certainly. Wrapped in the warm yellow glow of the wine, Rincewind tried to think of in-sewer ants in Circle C terms.
I don't think I understand this in-sewer ants, he said,
firmly, idly watching the world spin by.
Magic now, magic I understand.
Two-Flower grinned. Magic is one thing and reflected sound of underground spirits is another.
What?
What?
That funny word you used,
said Rincewind impatiently. Reflected sound of underground spirits?
Never heard of it.
Two-Flower tried to explain. Rincewind tried to understand. In the long afternoon, they toured the city turnwise of the river. Two-Flower led the way, with the strange picture box slung on a strap around his neck. Rincewind trailed behind, whimpering at intervals and checking to see that his head was still there. A few others followed, too. In a city where public executions, duels, fights, magical feuds, and strange events regularly punctuated the daily round, the inhabitants had brought the profession of interested bystander to a peak of perfection. They were, to a man, highly skilled gawpers. In any case, Two-Flower was delightedly taking picture after picture of people engaged in what he described as typical activities. And since a quarter Rhino would subsequently change hands for all their trouble, a tale of bemused and happy nouveau riches was soon following him in case this madman exploded in a shower of gold. At the temple of the seven-handed Sek, a hasty convocation of priests and ritual heart transplant artisans agreed that the 100-span-high statue of Sek was altogether too holy to be made into a magic picture, but a payment of 2 rhino left them astoundingly agreeing that perhaps he wasn't as holy as all that. A prolonged session at the horror pits produced a number of colorful and instructive pictures, a number of which Rincewind concealed about his person for detailed perusal in private. As the fumes cleared from his brain, he began to speculate seriously as to how the iconograph worked. Even a failed wizard knew that some substances were sensitive to light. Perhaps the plate glasses were treated by some arcane process that froze the light that passed through them. Something like that, anyway. Rincewind often suspected that there was something somewhere that was better than magic. He was usually disappointed. However, he took every opportunity to operate that box. Two-Flower was only too pleased to allow this, since that enabled the little man to appear in his own pictures. It was at this point that Rincewind noticed something strange. Possession of the box conferred a kind of power on the wielder, which was that anyone confronted with the hypnotic glass eye would submissively obey the most peremptory orders about stance and expression. It was while he was thus engaged in the Plaza of Broken Moons that disaster struck. Two-Flower had posed alongside a bewildered charm seller, his crowd of newfound admirers watching him with interest in case he did something humorously lunatic. Rincewind got down on one knee, the better to arrange the picture, and pressed the enchanted lever. The box said, "It's no good. I've run out of pink." A hitherto unnoticed door opened in the front of his eyes. A small, green, hideously warty humanoid figure leaned out, pointed at a color-encrusted palette in one clawed hand, and screamed at him. "No pink, see?" screeched the homunculus. "No good. You going on pressing the lever when there's no pink, is there? If you wanted pink, you shouldn't have took all those pictures of young ladies, should you? It's monochrome from now on, friend, all right?" "All right, yeah, sure," said Rincewind. In one dim corner of the little box, he thought he could see an easel, a tiny unmade bed, and he hoped he couldn't. "So long as that's understood," said the imp, and shut the door. Rincewind thought he could hear the muffled sound of grumbling and the scrape of a stool being dragged across the floor. "Two-Flower," he began and looked up. Two-Flower had vanished. As Rincewind stared at the crowd with sensations of prickly horror traveling up his spine, there came a gentle prod in the small of his back. "Turn without haste," said a voice like black silk, "or kiss your kidneys goodbye." The crowd watched with interest. It was turning out to be a good day. Rincewind turned slowly, feeling the point of the sword scrape along his ribs. At the other end of the blade he recognized Stren Withel, thief, cruel swordsman, disgruntled contender for the title of worst man in the world. "Hi," he said weakly. A few yards away he noticed a couple of unsympathetic men raising the lid of the luggage and pointing excitedly at the bags of gold. Withel smiled. It made an unnerving effort on the scar-crossed face. "I know you," he said. "A gutter wizard. What is that thing?" Rincewind became aware that the lid of the luggage was trembling slightly, although there was no wind, and he was still holding the picture box.
It makes pictures," he said brightly. "Hey, just hold that smile, will you?"
He backed away quickly and pointed the box. For a moment Withel hesitated.
"What?"
"That's fine, just hold it like that," said Rincewind. The thief paused and then growled and swung his sword back. There was a snap, and a duet of horrible screams. Rincewind did not look around, for fear of the terrible things he might see, and by the time Withel looked for him again, he was on the other side of the plaza, still accelerating. The albatross descended in wide, low sweeps that ended in an undignified flurry of feathers and a thump as it landed heavily on its platform in the patrician's bird garden. The custodian of the birds, dozing in the sun and hardly expecting a long-distance message so soon as after this morning's arrival, jerked to his feet and looked up. A few minutes later, he was scuttling through the palace corridors, holding the message capsule and, owing to carelessness brought on by surprise, sucking at the nasty beak wound on the back of his hand. Rincewind pounded down the alley, paying no heed to the screams of rage coming from the picture box, and cleared a high wall with his frayed rope flapping around him like the feathers of a disheveled jackdaw. He landed in the forecourt of a carpet shop, scattering the merchandise and customers, dived through its rear exit, trailing apologies, skidded down another alley and stopped, teetering dangerously just as he was about to plunge unthinkingly into the Ankh. There are said to be some mystic rivers, one drop of which can steal a man's life away. After its turbid passage through the twin cities, the Ankh could have been one of them. In the distance, the cries of rage took on a shrill note of terror. Rincewind looked around desperately for a boat or a handhold up the sheer walls on either side of him. He was trapped. Unbidden, the swell welled up in his mind. It was perhaps untrue to say that he had learned it. It had learned him. The episode had led to his expulsion from Unseen University because, for a bet, he had dared to open the pages of the last remaining copy of the Creator's own grimoire, the Octavo, while the university librarian was otherwise engaged. The spell had leapt out of the page and instantly burrowed deeply into his mind, whence even the combined talents of the Faculty of Medicine had been unable to coax it. Precisely which one it was they were also unable to ascertain, except that it was one of the 8 basic spells that were intricately interwoven with the very fabric of time and space itself. Since then, it had been showing a worrying tendency, when Rincewind was feeling run down or especially threatened, to try to get itself said. He clenched his teeth together, but the first syllable forced itself out around the corner of his mouth. His left hand raised involuntarily as the magical force whirled about him, began to give off octarine sparks. The luggage hurtled around the corner, its several hundred knees moving like pistons. Rincewind gaped. The spell died unsaid. The box didn't appear to be hampered in any way by the ornamental rug draped roguishly over it, nor by the thief hanging by one arm from the lid. It was, in a very real sense, a dead weight. Farther along the lid were the remains of 2 fingers, owner unknown. The luggage halted a few feet from the wizard, and after a moment retracted its legs. It had no eyes that Rincewind could see, but he was nevertheless sure that it was staring at him, expectantly. "Shoo," he said weakly. It didn't budge, but the lid creaked open, releasing the dead thief. Rincewind remembered about the gold. Presumably the box had to have a master. In the absence of Two-Flower, had it adopted him? The tide was turning, and he could see debris drifting downstream in the yellow afternoon light toward the river gate, a mere 100 yards downstream. It was the work of a moment to let the dead thief join them. Even if it was found later, it would hardly cause comment. and the sharks in the estuary were used to solid, regular meals. Rincewind watched the body drift away and considered his next move. The luggage would probably float. All he had to do was wait until dusk, and then he could go out with the tide. There were plenty of wild places downstream where he could wade ashore, and then, well, if the patrician really had sent out word about him, then a change of clothing and a shave should take care of that. In any case, there were other lands, and he had a facility for languages. Let him but get to Chimera, or Gonim, or Ecalpon, and a half-dozen armies couldn't bring him back, and then wealth, comfort, and security. There was, of course, the problem of Two-Flower. Rincewind allowed himself a moment's sadness. "It could be worse," he said, by way of farewell. "It could be me." It was when he tried to move that he found his robe was caught on some obstruction. By craning his neck, he found that the edge of it was being gripped firmly by the luggage's lid.
"Ah, Gorpo," said the patrician presently. "Come in, sit down. Can I present you a candied starfish?"
"I am yours to command, master," said the old man calmly, "save perhaps in the matter of preserved echidnoderms."
The patrician shrugged and indicated the scroll on the table.
"Read that,"
he said. Gorfel picked up the parchment and raised one eyebrow slightly when he saw the familiar ideograms of the Golden Empire. He read in silence for perhaps a minute, and then turned the scroll over to examine minutely the seal on the obverse.
"You are famed as a student of the Empire's affairs," said the patrician. "Can you explain this?"
"Knowledge in the matter of the Empire lies less in noting particular events than in the studying of certain casts of mind," said the old diplomat. "The message is curious, yes, but not surprising."
"This morning the Emperor instructed," the patrician allowed himself the luxury of a scowl, "instructed me, Gorfel, to protect this Two-Flower person. Now it seems I must have killed him. You don't find that surprising?" "No, it seems I must have him killed."
"No, the Emperor is more than a boy. He is idealistic, keen, a god to his people. Whereas this afternoon latter is, unless I am much mistaken, from 9 turning mirrors the Grand Vizier. He has grown old in the service of several emperors. He regards them as a necessary but tiresome ingredient in the successful running of the Empire. He does not like things out of place. The Empire was not built by allowing things to get out of place. That is his view."
"I begin to see," said the patrician.
"Quite so," Gorfel smiled into his beard. "This tourist is a thing that is out of place. After acceding to his master's wishes, 9 turning mirrors would, I am quite sure, make his own arrangements with a view to ensuring that one wanderer would not be allowed to return home, bringing perhaps the disease of dissatisfaction. The Empire likes people to stay where it puts them. So much more convenient than if this Two-Flower disappears for good in the barbarian lands. Meaning here, master."
"And your advice?"
said the patrician.
Gorfel shrugged. "Merely that you should do nothing. Matters will undoubtedly resolve themselves. However,"
he scratched an ear thoughtfully,
"perhaps the Assassin's Guild."
"Ah, yes," said the patrician. "The Assassin's Guild. Who is their president at the moment?"
"Slorf Flannelfoot, master."
"Have a word with him, will you?"
"Quite so, master."
The patrician nodded. It was all rather a relief. He agreed with 9 turning mirrors. Life was difficult enough. People ought to stay where they were put. Brilliant constellations shone down on the Discworld. One by one the traders shuttered their shops. One by one the ganefs, thieves, fine wirers, whores, illusionists, backsliders, and second-story men awoke and breakfasted. Wizards went about their polydimensional affairs. Tonight saw the conjunction of 2 powerful planets, and already the air over the magical quarter was hazy with early spells.
"Look,"
said Rincewind.
"this isn't getting us anywhere."
He inched sideways. The luggage followed faithfully, lid half open and menacing. Rincewind briefly considered making a desperate leap to safety. The lid smacked in anticipation. In any case, he told himself with a sinking heart the damn thing would only follow him again. It had that dogged look about it. Even if he managed to get to a horse, he had a nasty suspicion it would follow him at its own pace, endlessly, swimming rivers and oceans, gaining slowly every night when he had to stop to sleep. And then one day, in some exotic city and years hence, he'd hear the sound of hundreds of tiny feet accelerating down the road behind him. "You've got it wrong, man. You've got the wrong man. It's not my fault. I didn't kidnap him." The box moved forward slightly. Now there was just a narrow strip of greasy jetty between Rincewind's heels and the river. A flash of precognition told him that the box would be able to swim faster than he could. He tried not to imagine what it would be like to drown in the Ankh. "It won't stop until you give in, you know," said a small voice conversationally. Oh. Rincewind looked down at the iconograph, still hanging around his neck. Its trapdoor was open, and the homunculus was leaning against the frame, smoking a pipe and watching the proceedings with amusement. "I'll take you in with me, at least," said Rincewind through gritted teeth. The imp took the pipe out of his mouth. "What did you say?" he said. "I said I'll take you in it with me, damn it." "Suit yourself." The imp tapped the side of the box meaningfully. "We'll see who sinks first." The luggage yawned and moved forward a fraction of an inch. "Oh, all right," said Rincewind irritably, "but you'll have to give me time to think." The luggage backed off slowly. Rincewind edged his way back to a reasonable safe land and sat down with his back against the wall. Across the river, the lights of Ankh City glowed. "You're a wizard," said the picture imp. "You'll think of some way to find him." "Not much of a wizard, I'm afraid." "You can't just jump down on everyone and turn them into worms," the imp added encouragingly, ignoring his last remark. "No, turning to animals is an 8th level spell. I never even completed my training. I know only one spell." "Well, that'll do." "I doubt it," said Rincewind hopelessly. "What does it do, then?" "I can't tell you. No, I don't really want to talk about it. But frankly," he sighed, "no spells are much good. It takes 3 months to commit even a simple one to memory, and then once you've got it, poof, it's gone. That's what's so stupid about the whole magic thing, you know? You spend 20 years learning the spell that makes nude virgins appear in your bedroom, and then you're so poisoned by quicksilver fumes and half blind from reading old grimoires that you can't remember what happens next." "I never thought of it like that," said the imp. "Hey, look, this is all wrong. When Two Flowers said they got a better kind of magic in the Empire, I thought... The imp looked at him expectantly. Rincewind cursed to himself. "Well, if you must know, I thought he didn't mean magic, not as such." "What else is there, then?" Rincewind began to feel wretched. "I don't know," he said. "A better way of doing things, I suppose. Something with a bit of sense in it. Harnessing the lightning or something." The imp gave him a kind but pitying look. "Lightning is the spears hurled by the thunder giants when they fight," it said gently. "Established meteorological fact. You can't harness it." "I know," said Rincewind miserably. "That's the flaw of the argument, of course." The imp nodded and disappeared into the depths of the iconograph. A few moments later, Rincewind smelled bacon frying. He waited until his stomach couldn't stand the strain anymore and then rapped on the box. The imp reappeared. I've been thinking about what you've said," it said before Rincewind could open its mouth. "And even if you could get a harness on it, how could you get it to pull a cart?" "What the hell are you talking about?" "Lightning. It just goes up and down. You'd want it to go along, not up and down. Anyway, it'd probably burn through the harness." "I don't care about lightning. How can I think on an empty stomach?" "Eat something then. That's logic." "How? Every time I move that damn box flexes its hinges at me." The luggage on cue gaped widely. "See? It's not going to bite you," said the imp. "There's food in there. No, you're no use to it. Starved." Rincewind peered into the dark recesses of the luggage. There were indeed, among the chaos of boxes and bags of gold, several bottles and packages in oiled paper. He gave a cynical laugh, mooshed around the abandoned jetty until he found a piece of wood with about the right length, wedged it as politely as possible in between the gaps of the lid and the box, and pulled out one of the flat packages. It held biscuits that turned out to be as hard as diamond wood. "Bloody hell," he muttered, nursing his teeth. "Captain Eight Panther's Traveler's Digestives, them," said the imp from the doorway to his box. "Saved many a life at sea, they have." "Oh, sure. Do you use them as a raft, or you just throw them to the sharks and sort of watch them sink? What's in the bottles? Poison?" "Water." "But there's water everywhere. Why would he want water?" "Trust." "Trust?" "Yes, that's what he said. That's what he didn't. The water here, see?" Rincewind opened a bottle. The liquid inside might have been water. It had a flat, empty flavor with no trace of life. "Neither taste nor smell," he grumbled. The luggage gave a little creak, attracting his attention. With a lazy air of calculated menace, it shut its lid slowly, grinding Rincewind's impromptu wedge like a dry loaf. All right, I'm thinking," he said. Ymore's headquarters were in the leaning tower at the junction of Rhyme Street and Frost Alley. At midnight, the solitary guard leaning in the shadows looked up at the conjoining planets and wondered idly what change in his fortunes they might herald. There was the faintest of sounds, as of a yawning gnat. The guard glanced down the deserted street and now caught the glimmer of moonlight on something lying in the mud a few yards away. He picked it up. The lunar light gleamed on gold, and his intake of breath was almost loud enough to echo down the alleyway. There was a slight sound again, and another coin rolled into the gutter on the other side of the street. By the time he had picked it up, there was another. A little one, a little way off and still spinning. Gold was, he remembered, said to be formed from the crystallized light of stars. Until now he had never believed it to be true. That something as heavy as gold could fall naturally from the sky. As he drew level with the opposite alley mouth, some more fell. It was still in its bag. There was an awful lot of it, and Rincewind brought it down heavily on his head. When the guard came to, he found himself looking up into the wild-eyed face of a wizard, who was menacing his throat with a sword. In the darkness, too, something was gripping his leg. It was the disconcerting sort of grip that suggested the gripper could grip a whole lot harder if he wanted to. "Where is he? The rich foreigner," hissed the wizard. "Quickly!" "What's holding my leg?" said the man, with a note of terror in his voice. He tried to wriggle free. The pressure increased. "You wouldn't want to know," said Rincewind. "Pay attention, please. Where's the foreigner?" "Not here. They've got him at Broadman's place. Everyone's looking for him. You're Rincewind, aren't you? The box that bites people. Oh, no. Oh, please." Rincewind had gone. The guard felt the unseen leg gripper release his, or, as he was beginning to fear, its hold. Then, as he tried to pull himself to his feet, something big and heavy and square cannoned into him out of the dark and plunged off after the wizard, something with hundreds of tiny feet. With only his homemade phrasebook to help him, Two-Flower was trying to explain the mysteries of the inn-sewer ants to Broadman. The fat innkeeper was listening intently, his little black eyes glittering. From the other end of the table, Ynor watched with mild amusement, occasionally feeding one of his ravens with scraps from his plate. Beside him, Whittle paced up and down. "You fret too much," said Ymor, without taking his eyes from the two men opposite. "I can feel it, Stren. Who would dare attack us here? And the gutter wizard will come. He's too much of a coward not to. And he'll try to bargain, and then we shall have him, and the gold, and the chest." Whittle's one eye glared, and he smacked a fist into the palm with a black-gloved hand. "Who would have thought there was so much sapient pearwood in the whole of the disk?" he said. "How could we have known?" "You fret too much, Stren. I'm sure you can do better in this time," said Ymor pleasantly. The lieutenant snorted in disgust and strode off around the room to bully his men. Ymor carried on watching the tourist. It was strange, but the little man didn't seem to realize the seriousness of his position. Ymor had on several occasions seen him look around the room with an expression of deep satisfaction. He had also been talking for ages to Broadman, and Ymor had seen a piece of paper change hands, and Broadman had given the foreigner some coins. It was strange. When Broadman got up and waddled past Umore's chair, the thief-master's arm shot out like a steel spring and grabbed the fat man by his apron.
What was all about?
"Friend?" asked Umore quietly.
Nothing. Just private business like.
There are no secrets between friends, Broadman.
Well, I'm not sure about it myself, really. It's a sort of bet, see? Said the innkeeper nervously. In-sewer ants, it's called. It's like a bet that the broken drum won't get burned down.
Umore held the man's gaze until Broadman twitched in fear and embarrassment. Then the thief-master laughed.
This worm-eaten old tinder pile, he said. The man must be mad.
Yes, mad, but with money. He says now he's got can't remember the word that begins with a P. It's what you might call the stake money. The people he works for in the Agadian Empire will pay up if the broken drum burns down. Not that I hope it does burn down the broken drum. I mean, it's like a home to me is the drum.
Not entirely stupid, are you?
Said Umore, and pushed the innkeeper away. The door slammed back on its hinges and thudded into the wall.
Hey, that's my door!
Screamed Broadman. Then he realized who was standing at the top of the steps and ducked under the table a mere shaving of time before a short black dart sped across the room and thunked into the woodwork. Umore moved his hand carefully and poured out another flagon of beer.
Won't you join me, Zlorf? He said levelly. And put that sword away, Stren. Zlorf Flanafoot is our friend.
The president of the Assassin's Guild spun his short blowgun dexterously and slotted it into his holster in one smooth movement.
Stren,
said Umore. The black-clad thief hissed and sheathed his sword. But he kept his hand on the hilt and the eyes on the assassin. That wasn't easy. Promotion in the Assassin's Guild was a competitive examination, the practical being the most important, indeed the only part. Thus, Zlorf's broad, honest face was a welt of scar tissue, the result of many a close encounter. It probably hadn't been all that good-looking in any case. It was said that Zlorf had chosen a profession in which dark hoods, cloaks, and nocturnal prowlings figured largely because there was a day-fearing, trollish streak in his parentage. People who said this in earshot of Zlorf tended to carry their ears home in their hats. He strolled down the stairs, followed by a number of assassins. When he was directly in front of Umore, he said,
I've come for the tourist.
Is that any business? Any of your business, Zlorf?
Yes. Grinjo Ermond, take him.
Two of the assassins stepped forward. Then Stren was in front of them, his sword reappearing to materialize an inch from their throats without having to pass through the intervening air.
Perhaps I could kill one of you, he murmured. But I suggest you ask yourself which one.
Look up, Zlorf,
said Umore. A row of yellow, baleful eyes looked down from the darkness among the rafters.
One step more and you'll leave here with fewer eyeballs than you came with,
said the thief-master.
So sit down and have a drink, Zlorf, and let's talk about this sensibly. I thought we had an agreement. You don't rob, I don't kill. Not for payment, that is,
he added after a pause. Zlorf took the proffered beer.
So, he said, I'll kill him, then you rob him. Is he that funny-looking one over there?
Yes.
Zlorf stared at Two Flower, who grinned at him. He shrugged. I seldom wasted time wondering why people wanted other people dead. It was just a living.
Who is your client, may I ask?
Said Umore. Zlorf held up a hand.
Please, he protested, professional etiquette.
Of course, by the way.
Yes?
I believe I have a couple of guards outside.
Had.
And some others in the doorway across the street.
Formerly.
And 2 bowmen on the roof.
A flicker of doubt passed across Zlorf's face, like the last shaft of sunlight over a badly plowed field. The door flew open, badly damaged the assassin who was standing beside it.
Stop doing that!
Broadman shrieked from under his table. Zlorf and Umore stared at the figure on the threshold. It was short, fat, and richly dressed, very richly dressed. There were a number of tall, big shapes looming behind it, very big, threatening shapes.
Who's that?
Said Zlorf.
I know him,
said Umore.
His name's Rurpf. He runs the Groaning Platter Tavern down by the Brass Bridge. Stren, remove him.
Rurph held up his beringed hand. Stren Withel hesitated halfway to the door as several very large trolls ducked under the doorway and stood on either side of the fat man, blinking in the light. Muscles the size of melons bulged in forearms like flour sacks. Each troll held up a double-headed axe between thumb and forefinger. Broadman erupted from cover, his face suffused with rage. "Out!" he screamed. "Get those trolls out of here!" No one moved. The room was suddenly quiet. Broadman looked around. It began to dawn on him just what he had said and to whom. A whimper escaped from his lips, glad to be free. He reached the doorway to his cellars just as one of the trolls, with a lazy flick of one ham-sized hand, sent his axe whirling across the room. The slam of the door and its subsequent splitting as the axe hit it merged into one sound.
"Bloody hell!"
exclaimed Zlorf Flannelfoot.
What do you want?
Said Umor.
"I'm here on behalf of the Guild of Merchants and Traders.
Said Rurph evenly.
To protect our interests, you might say, meaning the little man."
Umor wrinkled his brows.
I'm sorry, he said. I thought I heard you say the Guild of Merchants.
"And traders,"
agreed Rurph. Behind him now, in addition to more trolls, were several humans that Ymor vaguely recognized. He had seen them, maybe, behind counters and bars, shadowy figures usually easily ignored, easily forgotten. At the back of his mind, a bad feeling began to grow. He thought about how it might be, say, a fox confronted with an angry sheep, a sheep, moreover, that could afford to employ wolves.
How long has this guild been in existence, may I ask? He asked.
"Since this afternoon,"
said Rurph.
"I'm Vice Guild Master in charge of tourism, you know."
What is this tourism of which you speak?
We are not quite sure,"
said Rurph. An old bearded man poked his head over the guildmaster's shoulder and cackled. Speaking on behalf of the wine cellars of Morpork, tourism means business, see?
Well,
said Rumor coldly.
"Well," said Rurph, "we're protecting our interests, like I said."
Thieves out! Thieves out! Cackled the elderly companion. Several others took up the chant. Zlorf grinned.
"And assassins,"
chanted the old man. And assassins! Chanted the old man. Zlorf growled.
"Stands to reason. People robbing and murdering all over the place," said Rurph. "What sort of impression are visitors going to take away? You'll come all the way to see our fine city, with its many points of historical and civic interest, also many quaint customs, and you wake up dead in some back alley, or as it might be floating down the Ankh. How are you going to tell all of this to your friends? What a great time you're having. Let's face it, you've got to move with the times."
Zlorf and Ymor met each other's gaze.
We have we?
Said Ymor.
"Then let us move, brother,"
agreed Zlorf. In one movement he brought out his blowgun, put it to his mouth, and sent a dart hissing toward the nearest troll. It spun around, hurling its axe, which whirred over the assassin's head and buried itself in a luckless thief behind him. Rurph ducked, allowing a troll behind him to raise its huge iron crossbow and fire a spear-length quarrel into the nearest assassin. That was the start. It has been remarked, before those who are sensitive to radiations in the far octarine, the eighth color, the pigment of the imagination, can see things that others cannot. Thus, it was that Rincewind, hurrying through the crowded, flare-lit evening bazaars of Morpork with the luggage trundling behind him, jostled a dark figure, turned to deliver a few suitable curses, and beheld death. It had to be death. No one else went around with empty eye sockets, and of course, the scythe over one shoulder was another clue. As Rincewind stared in horror, a courting couple, laughing at some private joke, walked straight through the apparition without appearing to notice it. Death, insofar as it was possible in a face with no moving features, looked surprised.
"Rincewind,"
Death said in tones as deep and heavy as the slamming of leaden doors far underground.
Um,
said Rincewind, trying to get back away from that eyeless stare.
But why are you here?
Boom, boom went crypt lids in the worm-haunted fastness under old mountains. Why not? Said Rincewind. Anyway, I'm sure you've got lots to do, so if you just, yeah.
I was surprised that you jostled me, Rincewind, for I have an appointment with thee this very night.
Oh, no, not.
Of course, what's so bloody vexing about the whole business is that I was expecting to meet thee in Phesopolis.
But that's 500 miles away.
You don't have to tell me. The whole system's got screwed up again. I can see that. Look, there's no chance of you.
Rincewind backed away, hands spread protectively in front of him. The dried fish salesman on a nearby stall watched the madman with interest. Not a chance.
I could lend you a very fast horse.
No.
It won't hurt a bit.
No. Rincewind turned and ran. Death watched him go and shrugged bitterly.
Sod you, then,
Death said. He turned and noticed the fish salesman. With a snarl, Death reached out a bony finger and stopped the man's heart, but he didn't take much pride in it. Then Death remembered what was due to happen later that night. It would not be true to say that Death smiled, because in any case his features were perforce frozen in a calcareous grin. But he hummed a little tune, cheery as a plague pit, and pausing only to extract the life from a passing mayfly and 1/9 of the lives of a cat cowering under the fish stall. All cats could see into the octarine. Death turned on his heel and set off toward the broken drum. Short Street, more pork, is in fact one of the longest in the city. Filigree Street crosses it its turnwise end in the manner of the crosswise of a T, and the broken drum is so placed that it looks down the full length of the street. At the furthermost end of Short Street, a dark oblong rose on hundreds of tiny legs and started to run. At first it moved at no more than a lumbering trot, but by the time it was halfway up the street, it was moving arrow fast. A dark shadow inched its way along one of the walls of the drum, a few yards from the two trolls who were guarding the door. Rincewind was sweating. If they heard the faint clinking of that specially prepared bags at his belt. One of the troll tapped his colleague on the shoulder, producing a noise like two pebbles being knocked together. He pointed down the starlit street. Rincewind darted from his hiding place, turned, and hurtled his burden through the drum's nearest window. Whittle saw it arrive. The bag arced across the room, turned slowly in the air, and burst on the edge of the table. A moment later, gold coins were rolling across the floor, spinning and glittering. The room was suddenly silent, save for the tiny noises of gold and the whimpers of the wounded. With a curse, Whittle dispatched the assassin he had been fighting.
It's a trick, he screamed. No one move!
3 men, and a dozen trolls froze mid-grope. Then for the third time, the door burst open. 2 trolls hurried through it, slammed it behind them, dropped the heavy bar across it, and fled down the stairs. Outside there was a sudden crescendo of running feet, and for the last time the door opened. It in fact exploded, the great wooden bar being hurled far across the room and the frame itself giving way. Door and frame landed on a table which flew into splinters. It was then that the frozen fighters noticed that there was something else in the pile of wood. It was a box, shaking itself madly to free itself from the smashed timbers around it. Rincewind appeared in the ruined doorway, hurtling another of his gold grenades. It smashed into a wall, showering coins. Down in the cellar, Broadman looked up, muttering to himself, and carried on with his work. His entire Spindle Winter's supply of candles had already been strewn on the floor, mixed with his store of kindling wood. Now he was attacking a barrel of lamp oil.
In sewer ants,
he muttered. Oil gushed out and swirled around his feet. Whittle stormed across the floor, a mask of rage on his face. Rincewind took careful aim and caught the thief full in the chest with the bag of gold. But now Ymor was shouting and pointing an accusing finger. A raven swooped down from its perch in the rafters and dived after the wizard, talons opening and gleaming. It didn't make it. About at the halfway point, the luggage leapt from the bed of splinters, gaped briefly in midair, and snapped shut. It landed lightly. Rincewind saw its lid open again, slightly, just far enough for a tongue, large as a palm leaf, red as mahogany, to lick up a few errant feathers. At the same time, the giant candle wheel fell from the ceiling, plunging the room into gloom. Rincewind, coiling himself like a spring, gave a standing jump and grasped a beam, swinging himself up into the relatively safe roof, with strength that amazed him. "Exciting, isn't it?" "Exciting, isn't it?" said a voice by his ear. Down below, thieves, assassins, trolls, and merchants all realized at the same moment that they were in a room made treacherous of foothold by gold coins and containing something among the suddenly menacing shapes in the semi-darkness that was absolutely horrible. As one, they made for the door, but had 24 different recollections of its exact position. High above the chaos, Rincewind stared at Two-Flower. "Did you cut the lights down?" he hissed. "Yes." "How come you're up here?" "I thought I'd better not get in everyone's way." Rincewind considered this. There didn't seem to be too much he could say. Two-Flower added, "A real brawl. Better than anything I'd imagined. Do you think I ought to thank them, or did you arrange it?" Rincewind looked at him blankly. "I think we ought to be getting down now," he said hollowly. "Everyone's gone." He dragged Two-Flower across the littered floor and then up the steps. They burst out into the tail end of the night. There were still a few stars, but the moon was down and there was a faint gray glow to rimward. Most importantly, the street was empty. Rincewind sniffed. "Can you smell oil?" "Can you smell oil?" he said. Then Whittle stepped out of the shadows and tripped him up. At the top of the cellar steps, Broadman knelt down and fumbled in his tinderbox. It turned out to be damp. "I'll kill that bloody cat," he muttered, and groped for the spare box that was normally on the ledge by the door. It was missing. Broadman said a bad word. He lighted a taper. A lighted taper appeared in mid-air right beside him. "Here, take this." "Thanks," said Broadman. "Don't mention it." Broadman went to throw the taper down the steps. His hand paused in mid-air. He looked at the taper, his brow furrowing. Then he turned around and held the taper up to illuminate the scene. It didn't shed much light, but it did give the darkness a shape. "Oh, no," he breathed. "But yes," said Death. Rincewind rolled. For a moment he thought Whittle was going to split him where he lay, but it was worse than that. He was waiting for him to get up.
I see you have
a sword, wizard," he said quietly. "I suggest you rise, and we'll see how well you use it."
Rincewind stood up slowly as he dared, and drew from his belt the short sword he had taken from the guard a few hours and 100 years ago. It was a short, blunt affair compared to Whittle's hair-thin rapier. "I don't know how to use a sword," he wailed.
"Good."
"You know that wizards can't be killed by edged weapons," said Rincewind desperately. Whittle smiled coldly.
"So I have heard," he said. "I'll look forward to putting it to the test."
He lunged. Rincewind caught the thrust by sheer luck, jerked his hand away in shock, deflected the second stroke by coincidence, and took the third one through his robe at heart height. There was a clink. Whittle's snarl of triumph died in his throat. He drew the sword out and prodded again at the wizard, who was rigid with terror and guilt. There was another clink, and cold gold coins began to drop out of the hem of the wizard's robe.
"So you bleed gold, do you?"
hissed Whittle. "But have you got gold concealed in that raggedy beard, you little—" And his sword went back for his final sweep. The sullen glow that had been growing in the doorway of the broken drum flickered, dimmed, and erupted into a roaring fireball that sent the walls billowing outward and carried the roof 100 feet into the air before bursting through it in a gout of red-hot tiles. Whittle stared at the boiling flames, unnerved, and then Rincewind leapt. He ducked under the thief's sword arm and brought his own blade around in an arc so incompetently misjudged that it hit the man flat first and jolted out of the wizard's hand. Sparks and droplets of flaming oil rained down as Whittle reached around with both gauntleted hands and grabbed Rincewind's neck, forcing him down.
"You did this!" he screamed. "You and your box of trickery!"
His thumb found RinceWind's windpipe. This is it, the wizard thought. Wherever I'm going, it can't be worse than here. Excuse me, said Two Flower. Rincewind felt the grip lessen. Now Whittle was getting slowly up and had a look of absolute hatred on his face. A glowing ember landed on the wizard. He brushed it off hurriedly and scrambled to his feet. Two Flower was behind Whittle, holding the man's own needle-sharp sword with the point resting in the small of the thief's back. Rincewind's eyes narrowed. He reached into his robe and then withdrew his hand, bunched into a fist. Don't move, he said. Am I doing it right? Asked Two Flower anxiously. He says he'll skewer your liver if you move, Rincewind translated freely. I doubt it, said Whittle. Bet? No. As Whittle tensed himself to turn on the tourist, Rincewind lashed out and caught the thief on the jaw. Whittle stared at him in amazement for a moment and then quietly toppled into the mud. The wizard uncurled his stinging fist and the roll of gold coins slipped through his throbbing fingers. He looked down at the recumbent thief. Good grief, he gasped. He looked up and yelled as another ember landed on his neck. Flames were racing along the rooftops on either side of the street. All around him, people were hurling possessions from windows and dragging horses from smoking stables. Another explosion in the white-hot volcano that was the drum sent the whole marble mantelpiece scything overhead. The Withershin Gate! It's the nearest, Rincewind shouted above the crackle of collapsing rafters. Come on! He grabbed Two Flower's reluctant arm and dragged him down the street. My luggage! Blast your luggage. Stay here much longer and you'll go where you don't need luggage. Come on, screamed Rincewind. They jogged on through the crowd of frightened people, leaving the area while the wizard took great mouthfuls of cool dawn air. Something was puzzling him. I'm sure all the candles went out, he said. So how did the drum catch fire? I don't know, moaned Two Flower. It's terrible, Rincewind. We were all getting along so well. Rincewind stopped in astonishment, so that another refugee cannoned into him, and he spun away with an oath. Getting on? Yes, a great bunch of fellows, I thought. Language is a bit of a problem, but they were so keen for me to join their party, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. Really friendly people, I thought. Rincewind started to correct him, then realized he didn't know how to begin. It'll be a blow for old Broadman, Two Flower continued. Still, he was wise. I've still got the Rhino he paid as his first premium. Rincewind didn't know the meaning of the word premium, but his mind was working fast. You insured the drum? He said. You bet, Broadman, it wouldn't catch fire? Oh, yes. Standard valuation, 200 Rhino. Why do you ask? Rincewind turned and stared at the flames racing toward them and wondered how much of Ankh-Morpork could be bought for 200 Rhino. Quite a large piece, he decided. Only not now, and not the way those flames were moving. He glanced down at the tourist. You, he began, and searched his memory for the worst word in Traub tongue. The happy little Beatrobby didn't really know how to swear properly. You, he repeated. Another hurrying figure bumped into him, narrowly missing him with the blade over its shoulder. Rincewind's tortured temper exploded. You little such a one who, while wearing a copper nose ring, stands in a footbath atop Mount Rahuraha during a heavy thunderstorm and shouts at Aluraha, goddess of lightning, and has the facial features of a diseased Aluraha root. Just doing my job, said the figure, stalking away. Every word fell as heavily as slabs of marble. Moreover, Rincewind was certain that he was the only one who had heard them. He grabbed Two Flower again. Let's get out of here, he suggested. One interesting side effect of the fire in Ankh-Morpork concerns the in-sewer ants policy, which left the city through the ravaged roof of the broken drum, was wafted high into the Discworld's atmosphere on the ensuing thermal, and came to Earth several days later and a few thousand miles away on the Alurahura bush in the Betrobi Islands. The simple, laughing islanders subsequently worshipped it as a god, much to the amusement of their more sophisticated neighbors. Strangely enough, the rainfall and the harvests in the next few years were almost supernaturally abundant, and this led to a research team being dispatched to the islands by the minor religions faculty of the Unseen University. Their verdict was that it was only went to show. The fire, driven by the wind, spread out from the drum faster than a man could walk. The timbers of the Widdershin gate were already on fire when Rincewind, his face blistered and reddened with the flames, reached them. By now, he and Two Flower were on horseback. Mounts hadn't been that hard to obtain. A wily merchant had asked 50 times their worth, and had been left gaping when 1,000 times their worth had been pressed into his hands. They rode through just before the first big gate timbers descended in an explosion of sparks. Moorpork was already a cauldron of flame. As they galloped up the red-lit road, Rincewind glanced sideways at his traveling companion, currently trying hard to learn to ride a horse. Bloody hell, he thought. He's alive. Me too. Who'd have thought it? Perhaps there is something in this reflected sound of underground spirits. It was a cumbersome phrase. Rincewind tried to get his tongue around the thick syllables that were the word in Two Flower's own language. Echolicorix, he tried. Ecrogonothics? Ecogonomics? That would do. It sounded about right. Several hundred yards downriver from the last smoldering suburb of the city, a strangely rectangular and apparently heavily waterlogged object touched the mud on the Widdershin bank. Immediately it sprouted numerous legs and scrambled for a purchase. Hauling itself to the top of the bank, the luggage, streaked with soot, stained with water, and very, very angry, shook itself and took its bearings, and then it moved away at a brisk trot, the small and incredibly ugly imp that was perching on its lid, watching the scenery with interest. Bravd looked at the weasel and raised his eyebrows. "And that's it," said Rincewind. "The luggage caught up with us. Don't ask me how. Is there any more wine?" The weasel picked up the empty wineskins.
"I think you've had just about enough wine this night," he said.
Bravd's forehead wrinkled. "Gold is gold," he said finally. "How can a man with plenty of gold consider himself poor? You're either poor or rich. It stands to reason." Rincewind hiccuped. He was finding reason rather difficult to hold on to. "Well," he said, "what I think is, the point is, well, you know, Octeron." The two adventurers nodded. The strange iridescent metal was almost as highly valued in the lands around the Circle Sea as sapient pearwood, and was about as rare. A man who owned a needle made of Octeron would never lose his way, since it always pointed to the hub of the Discworld. Being acutely sensitive to the disc's magical field, it would also miraculously darn his socks. "Well, my point is, you see, that gold also has its sort of magical field, sort of financial wizardry, economics." Rincewind giggled. The weasel stood and stretched. The sun was well up by now, and the city below them was wreathed in mist and full of foul vapors. Also gold, he decided. Even a citizen of Moorpork would, at the very point of death, desert his treasure to save his skin. Time to move. The little man called Two Flower appeared to be asleep. The weasel looked down at him and shook his head.
"The city awaits such as it is," he said. "Thank you for a pleasant tale, wizard. What will you do now?"
He eyed the luggage, which immediately backed away and snapped its lid at him. "Well, there's no ships leaving for the city now," giggled Rincewind. "I suppose we'll take the coast road to Churm. I've got to look after him, you see. But look, I didn't make it."
Sure,
said the weasel soothingly. He turned away and swung himself into the saddle of the horse that Bravd was holding. A few minutes later, the two heroes were just specks under the dust cloud, heading toward the charcoal city. Rincewind stared muzzily at the recumbent tourist, at two recumbent tourists. In his somewhat defenseless state, a stray thought, wandering through the dimensions in search of a mind to harbor it, slid into his brain. "Here's another fine mess you've got me into," he moaned and slumped backward. "Mad," said the weasel. Bravd, galloping along a few feet away, nodded. "All wizards get like that," he said. "It's the quicksilver fumes. Rots their brains. Mushrooms do."
"However,"
said the brown-clad one, He reached into his tunic and took out a golden disc on a short chain. Bravd raised his eyebrows. The wizard said that the little man had some sort of golden disc that told him the time, said the weasel.
Arouse your cupidity, little friend. You always were an expert thief, weasel.
Aye, agreed the weasel modestly. He touched the knob at the disc's rim and it flipped open. The very small demon imprisoned within looked up from its tiny abacus and scowled.
It lacks but 10 minutes to 8 of the clock,
It snarled. The lid slammed shut, almost trapping Weasel's fingers. With an oath, the weasel hurled the time teller far out into the heather where it possibly hit a stone. Something in an event caused the case to split. There was a vivid octarine flash and the whiff of brimstone as the time being vanished into whatever demonic dimension it called home.
What did you do that for?
Said Bravd, who hadn't been close enough to hear the words.
Do what? Said the weasel. I didn't do anything. Nothing happened at all. Come on, we're wasting opportunities.
Bravd nodded. Together they turned their steeds and galloped toward the ancient Ankh and honest enchantments.